Hello, everyone. NWE War Reports here with the 8th of April 2023 frontline update for the Russo Ukrainian War. We have some very, very big news today in terms of the front lines in the Donbass, starting with Bakhmut. It appears some very big developments in here have happened over the last 48 hours. Some very bad developments for the Ukrainian side. There's a lot of information floating around. Some things are a little more certain. We can confirm them. Some more reliable sources have reported on them. Some less reliable sources are saying that Ukraine is somehow um, exiting Bakhmut. They've made a decision to leave Bakhmut and set up a defensive line outside the city. I am obviously very skeptical of that. We'll go over that claim here in just a few minutes. First of all, I am going to start with the intersection of the MiG 17 that was destroyed several weeks back. Now, if you guys will remember the last time we talked about this area, I was saying that it was crucial for Ukraine to hold on to essentially two locations. One here was the school number two, I believe what it is, and then the other location is these high rises. In addition, there's another school inside these high rises as well as a post office. This entire area has fallen to Russian forces. So, very, very bad development for Ukraine. I'll go ahead and plot that out for you guys. What we're seeing, the most recent frontline reports are saying that an area essentially like this is the new zone of control for the Russians. There's very heavy fighting going on in this area right here. So where I have the X here, this area, there's extremely heavy fighting, extremely heavy battles. It definitely is. It appears like the Russians are trying to finish this area off. They're going to want to try and push down and take this warehouse as well as push up and take these warehouses here. These are the last two possible defense points for the Ukrainians in this corner of the city. Should these two locations fall here, should the Russians move up and capture a certain area, let's say, like this, essentially there is no southern flank left for the Ukrainians inside of Bakhmut. The Russians can freely start moving through these fields. So they could easily start moving up through here, which is very typical Russian movement to move up in along tree lines. There's probably a long trench line right through here, so if they can break into that, they can start moving up and clear it out and basically encircle Bakhmut. So there is some, I guess, credence to the claim that Ukraine might be retreating from Bakhmut. It's certainly possible because, depending on the outcome of these battles here, if these warehouses fall to the Russians, it's going to be very, very, very hard for Ukraine to hold on to Bakhmut. Of course, they have this central high-rise zone here, in the middle western part of Bakhmut that they could hold on to, but they'll be restricted to just these two roads basically that come into this intersection, and the safety of these troops and the success of this defense depends on how well they can hold back the Russians from moving towards these intersections. And without this defense perimeter on the outside, I would suggest it's probably going to be very difficult. So it's not completely baseless. I think there is some chance or possibility behind it, but at the moment, most of the reporting I'm seeing is saying that Ukraine is still holding the defense in Bakhmut. Now they are retreating in some areas. The retreat has actually continued inside of the downtown area, almost the entire downtown area. I would actually say the entire downtown area is now in the hands of Russia. In terms of, like, if you were to say the central district, everything from the river to the rail line, a little bit of it is still being held by the Ukrainians. We're going to go through that. Their defense is essentially ringed around two locations. One is the train station, essentially this area right here. I guess you could say this intersection, and then this rail yard to the south. This is the defensive ring for them. And then to the north of that, a second defensive ring has formed around this other industrial zone rail yard, and they do hold some buildings on the opposite side of the railroad. So, two defensive rings right here. Both have uh, real estate on the eastern side of the railroad. So, this isn't entirely unexpected. I figured the front line would balance somewhere in this area. In the middle, you see there's like a bunch of high-rise buildings in this zone, so this kind of makes for a good defensive barrier. How long they'll be able to hold it is uncertain, with the Russians potentially moving up from the south in this area. But this is the current situation. So everything else is under Russian control. So we're looking at a Russian zone of control, essentially like this. So a very large section of town taken in the last 48 hours. Definitely a couple, 5-10% of the city, somewhere in that range has fallen to the Russians in that time period. Not very good developments. Of course, this was mostly abandoned territory by the Ukrainians. They, voluntarily retreated from this area, and Russia moved in. That's one of the reasons why, it's fallen so quickly. You can kind of tell with these battles. Like, if there's a lot of territory captured very quickly by the Russians, it's probably because it's been abandoned, and they didn't have to fight for it. But, the fight for that territory happened. In the previous weeks. There's a reason why it was abandoned. So, Ukraine holding the defense line in the center here around the railroad, trying to hold back a Russian onslaught here around Rose Alley. We don't have any updates about any movement in this direction, but nevertheless, Russia is putting pressure there. It seems like over the last, specifically 12 hours of fighting before nighttime hit, and possibly going into the night, most of the fighting was going on in this southern, southwestern corner of the town. So, if you're worried about Ukraine's position, this is the area you should be most concerned about. Is down here. All right. So, real quick to cover like other sections of the front line, we typically gloss over where the fighting is every day. Just looking at the Ukrainian MOD report, they're reporting assault actions in the same 3 locations. It is important to note that in the area of Kremenna, Syriac Maps has actually given some insight on this area and corrected the front line some, which we actually don't really have to mess with here. But at one point, the Russians had advanced a little deeper into the forested areas, perhaps maybe capturing something like this. It's tough really to tell. His most recent report is saying that Ukraine launched a counterattack and managed to retake the road right here and have their main defense along this road. So, I would guess that, everything else is probably under Russian control. I don't know if we're not going to put new boxes or new lines or anything on here. We're just going to adjust the lines we got. So just so we have a little more of an accurate view there of the front line. In terms of where the other fighting is, we have reports, of course, in the area around Avdiivka. It seems like the main push here in Avdiivka right now is in the southern areas. The Russians need to try and correct their lines a little more in their favor here. This is not a simple task. They've been fighting for the area of Pervomaisk for months now and haven't made a lot of progress. So, whether they're going to do more of the same just with more resources or whether they have something different hidden up their sleeves, it's really tough to tell here. But I mean, that's kind of like generally the reporting that's going on is saying that the Russians are trying to finish off Pervomaisk before they try to continue any kind of assault on Avdiivka, which I kind of hypothesized this previously. I had mentioned that if the Russians really want to put Avdiivka in more of a bind, they would need to fix their flanks, get some pretty big buffer zones around these flanks to strengthen them. You know what I'm saying? So like you get like a more solid front line, not such a sketchy, edgy front line, and then you can start to place artillery closer up to the front with a little bit more safety, I guess you could say. So you could put your guns, in some fields or something, and move them around in these areas potentially, and then shell Orlivka. Now, I mean, currently Orlivka can already be shelled, but it's being shelled from further back. Probably the artillery is a little less accurate. You don't have spotters like right on the front line, telling you exactly when a vehicle's coming through or not coming through. So, there's definitely a lot of advantages to creating like larger buffers on the flanks here, especially if the Russians are trying to encircle and force the Ukrainians out of Avdiivka. So that's the situation going on there. And then finally, once again, we have reports of fighting near Marinka and Pobeda. This isn't anything new. There's sporadic fighting here all the time. Um, but yeah, that's most of the reports of fighting on the front line. So real quick, we're about at 11 minutes. So to talk about I guess each side's performance over the winter time. It's April the 8th. It's 64 degrees where I am right now. I think it's safe to say for a lot of northern hemisphere of the world, we're entering into springtime. They just got a big snow in the Donbass, so they might be a week or so later. But we're basically coming into spring here. So to talk about the winter performance and kind of like grade it, give it a rating for each side. I would say that in terms of um, Ukraine's performance on the defense, it's been pretty outstanding. Outside of the Bakhmut Solidar area where they were just straight up outmaneuvered. Probably due to competent command on the Wagner side, and I'm not talking about Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's just basically an entrepreneur. I mean, you see video of him in the command post and talking about strategy and stuff like that, but I'm not really convinced by it. I'm sure he's just kind of there more in a learning capacity, but like there's actual commanders for the Wagner organization that work for him that orchestrated this northern push here, and this was really the biggest success for the Russians and the biggest failure for the Ukrainians. It's essentially this area right here, everything above this line. So in terms of that, if you consider that the Russian winter offensive, that bit was successful. It still hasn't completed its ultimate goal of capturing Bakhmut. That very well might happen in the next few days. Very well might not. As you guys know, I've tried to make predictions several times over the past couple months, and they always end up wrong. So I don't really like to make predictions. But in terms of the rest of the front line, I'd say that both sides, the Ukrainian side did pretty good on the defensive around Vuhledar. The Russians, kind of had a big disaster at Vuhledar. I would say the Ukrainians overall in the wintertime outperformed the Russians in everywhere except for the Bakhmut area. Now, they didn't manage to gain back any ground anywhere or anything. The main achievement overall, if you were to average everything out through the winter, was for the Ukrainian side was holding the Russians back at Vuhledar. And honestly, considering the situation at Bakhmut, I don't think, you can't really lay too much blame on the Ukrainians because Russia threw so much resources at it and so much of their most experienced and best stormtroopers. It was I don't want to say it was inevitable, but the situation at Bakhmut was always going to be the toughest battle for Ukraine, and they are facing off against Russia, which is comparatively a colossus against Ukraine. So overall, I think Ukraine has outperformed Russia in terms of what you would expect from them. Has clearly underperformed through the winter, but that doesn't mean that trend will continue. I think I've been looking a lot into stuff, and I think the Russians probably will be looking to wrap up the war this year in 2023. And, it might go on to 2024. I guess we'll have a better view of that probably by July or August of this year, in a couple months. If nothing serious has changed by then I would say the war will probably go on another year. But at this point, it looks like neither side is willing at all to negotiate. The Ukrainian side, it would be basically political suicide for them to negotiate. One of Zelensky's ministers actually said as much, because there was some news that Zelensky might be willing to negotiate with Vladimir Putin over the status of Crimea, um, which is an interesting piece. And I honestly, like, I think someone who had a great opinion on this was Alexander Mercurius. He was talking about this. Some people thought that what Zelensky had meant by, if basically what he said is, if they have a successful counterattack and they take back some land in the spring, then they would be willing to negotiate over Crimea. And some people took that as, oh, Zelensky is willing to, if they can take back maybe Zaporozhye and Kherson regions and their entirety, then they'll be willing to let the Russians have Crimea. Mercurius was saying that basically that's not what he meant. What they meant was after they took back the land, they would try to negotiate Crimea's peaceful transfer back to Ukraine, from Russia, which obviously will never happen. Russia is going to fight for every inch of it. It's Russia sees Crimea as critical to their national survival. It's one of the reasons why they marched in and took it 9 years ago in the first place. So I'm convinced that Russia might go nuclear over Crimea, but let's knock on wood. That's just a, a bad read on my part, I hope. But yeah, so like I don't think either side is anywhere near close to negotiating. Ukraine, is clearly building up a large assault force to try to commit to some kind of offensive. Some recently there were some leaked NATO documents allegedly. I'm not entirely convinced. I was telling a colleague of mine, I think it's very possible that the documents were leaked intentionally to throw off the Russians. This kind of thing is done all the time. Like where intentionally leak false or bad intelligence. What the documents were saying though, which I'm not going to share them. I'm an American citizen, and they're potentially um, top secret, CIA, Pentagon documents. So I'm not even going to take a risk there. But other people have shared and talked about them, and we do have freedom of speech. So I'm going to tell you guys basically what was going on with it. But they were full of. It was basically an assessment of the situation in Ukraine and an assessment of the strength of the new brigades that Ukraine was creating, the type of equipment they were being assigned, and where they were. There's a little bit of it kind of on this deployment map here. We'll go ahead and go to that. As you can see, there's like essentially 3 groupings in the middle of Ukraine. I said I would fix that, but there's a grouping down here to the bottom left-hand side of the screen around Odessa and Mykolaiv. There's a couple brigades down here, the 21st Mechanized, the 41st Mechanized, 22nd Mechanized. There's also a grouping of mechanized brigades, newly formed mechanized brigades in the Dnipro area. And there's also a group being formed in the Dnipro-Poltava area on the other side of the river. So there's three groupings. It looks like about 60,000 troops, um, equipped with NATO equipment. I believe we talked about this in the past, that this is something likely they would do. They would try not to form any particular tank brigades. They would be looking to form mechanized and motorized brigades that could had a certain density of heavy equipment that can potentially make breakthroughs. We've seen a lot of training footage of Strikers, of Bradleys, of a little bit of footage of Western tanks. Ukrainian troops being trained up on those. So they're definitely looking to use this force. A lot of Western news sources are talking about this leak as like some big kind of deal, because some of the things that the Russians were able to get from it was the exact strength and numbers of these Ukrainian brigades. And not only that, there was some kind of information on HIMARS that they were able to get from these documents. I'm not sure, and I'm not going to say exactly what it was. If you guys are really interested, you can look them up and find it yourself. I didn't break down the documents like 100%. Like I read them over, like glossed them over, and I'm half convinced that it could be fake intelligence released intentionally, and I'm half convinced that it could be real. The story I got of like how it was released, apparently the shit was floating around on Discord. I have a hard time believing um, that um, someone could release this information and the U.S. intelligence not know who did it. And they're very good at this sort of thing in terms of like clearances, like who has access to what documents. If this did get released and they don't know who did it, that means that a large number of people had access to this document. Like it's a big list, a couple thousand people perhaps, and that is kind of a low level of security clearance, if you ask me. Like if so many people had access to it that they have no idea who could have released it, because it doesn't take much to figure out, like, all right, well, we got x amount number of people that had access to this document. They can probably look and see like how many people accessed that particular document on that day or a couple days before it was leaked, and then they could extrapolate or whatever and see how many people I'm sorry, extrapolate's not the right word, but they can continue down that path and see how many people are present on Discord and all these different channels and stuff. I don't think it's very hard, but yeah, it's very clear that Ukraine has built up a strong force for some kind of counterattack. Where that's going to be, we don't know. But nevertheless, overall, to summarize everything in the episode, it looks like Bakhmut is in some serious trouble at the moment, and the area is probably too muddy for this strike force to make any kind of move to save the situation. There's a big chance of that. Like, I know there's a lot of people out there that want to see Ukrainian counterattack and recapture Bakhmut, but I don't know. It would be an incredible circumstance if that happened. Admittedly. All right, guys, that's it for me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.